procedures, or let's say pre-warm-up procedures in a quest for an injury prevention. So we will discuss one specific area that we didn't mention so far, but I think it is very, very important in all team sports, especially in soccer. So the topic of the lecture is the warm-up for injury prevention, or hip mobility. And we will start, I will try in 20-25 minutes maybe, to explain you the basic concept and this very interesting theory, which is everyday practice for most of team sports athletes, including soccer players. So you know, when we are discussing sport achievements, we can say that there are basically three main areas, three big determinants of athletes' success. So the first is genetics. Yes, if you want to be a Olympic champion or a world champion, you need to choose your parents wisely. It is a well referenced quote by one very famous exercise physiologist in 20th century in Europe. So there are plenty examples for this. I choose one. For example, this is one of the most famous track and field athletes of all times, arguably one of the best sprinters ever. He won gold Olympic medals, etc., etc. So he was very, very successful. But when you look at his background, you can tell that he was genetically determined to be a top-level athlete. Why? Because his father was a professional NFL player, and his mother was USA Olympic track and field team. So genetically gifted man meet genetically gifted woman, and they create a son which become one of the most famous athletes. So the second determinant of sport achievement is diet or supplementation, and the third one is training. And we will discuss a little bit more about training. Nowadays there are new trends that are coming mostly from scientific researchers. There are more than 25,000 scientific articles published in the area of sport science all over the world. And those new scientific knowledges are very important because they are pushing forward our everyday practice. And development of sports science is almost as fast as IT technology. And why this is important? Because when you look at IT technology, you can relate also this to the sports science. Something that was best in the world, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, it looks ridiculous nowadays. So what does it mean? The best few years ago doesn't exist today. So you always need to look up for the new things and for the new trends. And when we are discussing the sports itself, it is also very important always to look at the new trends that are coming. So basically, what can we say in sports generally in the past 10 years? What's new? There are a couple of things, but what I found most interesting is so-called prehabilitation. So there is a general trend in soccer and generally in sport to try to deal more with injury. Why with injury? Because injury incidence is increasing worldwide, and the costs are huge. I don't know, there are some exact numbers, I don't remember them anymore, but there are some exact numbers, for example in NBA. How much does it cost when you have a top-level superstar injured and not playing for a couple of games? So the similar is in soccer also. If top-level player doesn't play a game, it's not just a competitive edge that you will not reach because of his absence, but also most likely you will have fewer spectators, you will have fewer broadcast TV spectators, etc., etc. So you will decrease the level of interest for the game if for example, you have some top-level soccer player not playing. So in the past 10 years, we are becoming aware of that, and now the strength and conditioning process and generally the training process in those most of the sports is more targeted into how to prevent injuries, because the worst thing you can have is to have your top level player or somebody in the first squad injured. And so one of the most interesting questions in the past decade or so is, why do athletes get injured in the first place? And there are no one simple answer, but generally there is a new trend that non-optimal movement creates compensation in movement patterns, which creates disbalance, which can create pain and eventually injury. So there is a new trend relatively new trend in training called the functional training that is based on this assumption that you need to train the movement, not the muscle, with some brilliant quotes. And one of the reasons for the injury was presented some 10 to 15 years ago by one of the most famous strength and conditioning coach called Michael Boyle, and his very good friend and one of the most respectable physiotherapists in United States of America, Gray Cook. And to make long story short, they stated that generally, when you want to simplify things, you can say that injuries are going to occur when you have improper movement pattern, and you create movement in joints. Yes, so the movements are created in joints. So generally, those two guys discuss in one evening, during one dinner, and they discuss it, and they came up with this very clever and very interesting idea. And they call this joint by joint approach. And what this approach stated generally, they said in this approach that our body is basically made of stack of joints, placed one on another. And every joint in our body has its specific function and is prone to predictable dysfunction. So they said, consequently, every joint in our body has its specific needs that should be addressed and should be met by exercises. So what they said, to make it simple, they said that when you look at the athlete body, every joint in her body, in this example, had specific function. For example, ankle should have mobility, good level of mobility in order to be able to provide every movement. Opposite to that, knee should have stability. The hip, which we are going to discuss a little bit more in details, is a tricky one. The hip is a tricky one. It should have both mobility and stability, but in most cases nowadays we lack mobility in hip region. Above hip region is a lumbar spine, and lumbar spine should be stable. Opposite to thoracic spines, which should be mobile. Opposite to scapula, which should be stable, and above scapula is the shoulder, which should be mobile. So this is joint by joint approach. Mobility, stability, mobility, stability, mobility, stability, mobility. And what those two phenomenal guys said some 10, 15 years ago, they said, if some joint doesn't have a proper quality, let's say if ankle lacks mobility, then some movement, some compensation must be made. Some joints must took over the mobility capacity of the ankle. And in this specific situation, it will be knee. But knee should be stable. So if you lack mobility in ankle, you will increase, inevitably, you will increase the mobility of the knee. And when you increase the mobility of the knee, you increase the incidence injury. So they said this is joint by joint approach. And if we lack mobility of the ankle, then we should address this through specific set of exercises in the warm-up, or more likely in the pre-warm-up procedure before the practice or the game. So this is excellent point. Let me just underline a little bit. This joint by joint approach is very well advocated and presented in everyday practice. It is not based so much on scientific evidences, but on very excellent idea from these two guys, and it seems it has very big merit in everyday practice. And as I am aware of, even today, even nowadays, I don't know any top-level athletes that I work with or I saw training that doesn't use some of the drills presented in this joint-by-joint approach in order to improve the specific needs of specific joints. So, why this is important? When you look at neurodevelopment, as babies we have tremendous amount of joint mobility. We maintain that as a children and lose it afterwards because of most likely position and postural habits. So when you look at babies, when they play in the sand, it's regular for them to look like this, in an excellent deep squat position with excellent hip mobilities. And after a few years, when this child that was once playing in this excellent hip mobility, deep squat position, when he grew up, suddenly he began to do similar movements like this. So, what is the problem? What is the general problem with this? Well, it seems that in nowadays in everyday practice, most of the top level athletes, most of the people worldwide are lacking proper hip mobility. Or as Shakira used to say, hips don't lie. Yeah? You need to develop hip mobility in a proper way in order to function properly. So what is the big problem in everyday practice of top-level athletes? We have the adult hip nowadays has a generally poor level of mobility, hip mobility. Why? Well, generally this is the result of lack of squatting, lack of basic movement patterns, and because of sitting posture, which is very common to us nowadays. We are sitting for hours nowadays. What are the causes? Because of this nowadays way of living? Well, the general consequences are decreased length of hip flexors. So, because we sit too much, we have decreased length of hip flexors, and reciprocally, we have the inhibition of the gluteus muscles. And because we have an inhibition of gluteus muscles, we have anterior pelvic tilt, more commonly presented in everyday population, and also in top-level athletes. And what are also the consequences of low level of hip mobility, or what are the consequences of hip hypomobility? There are evident changes in functional movement pattern, and as a consequence of decreased mobility of the hips, we have increased demands of the mobility of joints that are close to this one, the previous or the next one. So, if you have decreased hip mobility, as a consequence, the same person will need to compensate with increased or knee mobility or lower back pain mobility. And this most likely will increase the injury risk. Because as we state a couple of minutes before, if you compensate with increased knee mobility, you increase the level of incidence risk of knee injury, or when you increase the mobility of the lower back region, you increase the incidence of getting low back pain syndrome, because this low back pain most likely is not created for movement. It is created for withstand compressive loads, and it's not meant to rotate too much. Thoracic spine is responsible for this kind of movement. So if you need to increase the lumbar region mobility because of a low level of hip mobility, you will most likely increase the incidence injury risk for this part of the body. Not just this, what are also consequences of low level of hip mobility? It's very interesting. It is proved also in sports science. The low level of hip mobility is directly related to decreases in athletic performance. For example, you have decreased strength outputs, decreased power outputs, and decreased speed outputs just because you lack hip mobility or mobility of the hip region. So generally we can say that if you have problems with the hip mobility, most likely you will have increased injury risk, but also you limit your exercise performance. And as we stated earlier, it is a common problem in athletic field, in general population, but also in athletic population nowadays. So what can be done? So what can be done? Well, first of all, there is one very important question. When we lack hip mobility, during developmental stages, we lose some of the mobility in our hip region. Is it a reversible process or not? Luckily for us, it is not reversible. For example, in some parts of the world where you have different cultures, it is usual for older people to look like this. Or you can see, when you train properly, it is very possible to improve hip mobility. So, luckily for us, with exercises, we can change hip mobility issues. So, what is the rationale for low level of hip mobility? Is to include in warm-up, or even better, in pre-warm-up procedure, is to include some specific drills to improve the level of hip mobility. And I will present you some of the most famous or some of the exercises that are regularly done on everyday basis in most of the sports, including soccer. For example, one of the most recognizable hip mobility stretches is a world greatest stretch. You see how it looks like, and it increases, very nice drill to increase the level of mobility of the hip region. Or some of the drills that I love to do with my players. You can see this example. So there are three movement patterns in this exercise. This is a mobility flow drill. You see hip flexor stretch, something like, and the pigeon at the end. So those are drills that should be done for a couple of times. Or animal flow drill. I love to do this. So you see a knee hug, deep lunge, rotate, pigeon, frog, and duck at the end. So you get it why I called it the animal flow. Or maybe the best drill I ever saw. I saw it from one specialist from US. So 90-90, on knees up, rotate, something like front lunge. This is for the adductor muscle and hip region, and deep squat. And deep squat, and vice versa. Adductors, hip flexors, and sit down and rotate. And this is the half of the drill. Yes, this is the half of the drill. The second half is on the other side. And maybe one more. Maybe one more. So basic, the most popular drill, 90-90 hip mobility. You see there are three positions. You put legs in a specific position, and we can see it one more time. 90-90. First position, then touch your ankle, and then touch the opposite knee. And those are some of the drills. Those are some of the drills for increasing hip mobility. I specifically oriented on hip mobility drills because for most of the population, athletic population, hip mobility is most common issue. Most common issue. Of course, we didn't present whole joint by joint approach, but for every ankle, for every joint in our body, there are specific drills to increase stability or increase mobility in order to become more functional and to be able to produce more functional movement pattern and as a consequence to increase the injury risk. So those are very simple to do, energetically not demanding drills that you can do on a regular basis during the warm-up, or even better, during pre-warm-up procedure, in order to address specific issues if you considering joint mobility or stability. And at the end, when I was first introduced to this specific joint by joint approach, I was a little bit reluctant, I must admit, 10 years ago or more now. I was a little bit reluctant to use those drills. It seems to me at the time that those drills, I didn't understand them quite well. This joint by joint approach is not well founded in a scientific publications, so I was a little bit reluctant. But you know, as time passed by, after a couple of months, I realized that I should try them, and I believe that it's better to change an opinion than to persist in a wrong one. Now 10 or 15 years ago, or 15 years later, I am regularly doing some of those drills for hip or some other joint mobility stability with all of my athletes, and I warmly recommend also for everybody, including attendance of this lecture, to use them in order to decrease the injury incidence risk. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again in a couple of weeks.